He couldn't fail. His grandmother depended on him. The silent scream pierced young Ayana's mind as 800 pairs of hungry eyes emerged from the shadows, each howl a promise of death on the frozen tundra. The 71-degree air burned his lungs, the scent of predator permeated the night, and with trembling hands but a heart ablaze, he knew this hunt would change everything, or end everything. Ayana swallowed hard, the metallic taste of fear in his mouth. His eyes, accustomed to the white vastness, now strained to discern the slender forms moving in a semicircle, tightening the noose. They weren't just wolves, it was a hungry grey tide, an army of teeth and claws, driven by a desperate need he knew all too well. The difference was that their hunger meant the end of his. He felt the intense cold of Yakutia pierce his reindeer-hide garments, but it was the chill of the impending battle that made him tremble more. His grandmother, lying in the small cabin miles away, frail and paralyzed, depended on that piece of meat he didn't yet have, and on his life now hanging by a thread, suspended in the icy air. With immense effort, Ayana pulled an arrow from the makeshift quiver on his back. His fingers, already numb from the biting cold, could barely grip the rough wood. He remembered his grandfather's lessons, whispered around the campfire. "The wolf respects courage, Ayana. Show it you are more dangerous than its prey." But how to show such courage before a legion of predators? He looked at the rudimentary bow in his hands, made of birchwood and reindeer sinew, an extension of his own hope and deep ancestral wisdom. It wasn't a weapon to fell 800 beasts, but perhaps it was enough to plant doubt in their wild hearts. A larger wolf, with darker fur and cunning eyes, stepped forward, a low, guttural growl echoing in the oppressive silence of the tundra. It was the leader, Old Grey, as the elders called him, a legend among hunters for his intelligence and ferocity. Ayana raised his bow, the arrow's tip aimed at the animal's chest, but without the intention of fatally wounding it. Ancestral wisdom did not permit the waste of life, and gratuitous violence was a path to darkness. His goal was to drive them away, disperse the pack, not destroy it. He needed meat for his grandmother, not a pile of dead wolves that would bring neither comfort nor sustenance. The young man felt cold sweat trickle down his back, mixing with the ice. Every breath was a painful effort, every heartbeat a pulsating reminder of imminent danger. He couldn't run. There was nowhere to go in the desolate white vastness. His eyes swept the landscape, searching for any advantage, any shadow, any irregularity in the terrain that could offer temporary refuge. But the tundra was flat, merciless, and the wolves were everywhere, closing the circle. Ayana pressed his lips together, a thin line of determination replacing terror. He was not an experienced warrior, just a boy in the early years of his youth. But the unconditional love for his grandmother gave him a strength he never imagined possessing. It was a love that drove him to face the impossible, to challenge the very nature of Yakutia. He took a deep breath, the icy air burning his nostrils, and prepared for what was to come. The battle for his grandmother's life and his own was about to begin, and he would not back down. Ayana, muscles tense and bow firmly raised, felt a shiver down his spine, not just from the cold, but from the imminent attack. Old Grey, yellow eyes fixed on his, let out a long, piercing howl, echoing across the plain. In response, the pack moved, not in a disordered attack, but like a silent grey wave, each wolf a link of hunger. Ayana pressed his lips together, his heart pounding. He couldn't hesitate. With a hoarse cry, almost inaudible over the wind and growls, Ayana released the first arrow. He didn't aim at any wolf, but at the space in front of the leader, embedding it in the snow with a sharp hiss. The unexpected sound made Old Grey pause for an instant, caution replacing ferocity. Ayana seized the pause, drawing another arrow. His fingers aching, moved with agility, propelled by adrenaline. He knew each arrow was precious, a limited resource against unlimited force. The pack, however, was too vast to be intimidated by a single projectile. While the leader pondered, wolves on the flanks began to circle, moving with cunning. Ayana spun his body, his eyes sweeping the horizon, trying to anticipate their next move. He remembered his grandmother's words about the dance with nature, about reading the signs. "The tundra speaks, my grandson," she would say. "You just need to learn to listen." And now the tundra spoke through the wind whipping his face and the patterns in the snow the wolves left behind. He retreated a few steps, keeping his bow raised, his eyes fixed on Old Grey's. It was a duel of wills, a test of who would yield first. Ayana felt the weight of responsibility, his grandmother's face appearing in his mind, her gentle wrinkles, her faint smile, the fragility he had sworn to protect. That image was a shield stronger than any armor, a fire that warmed his spirit against the biting cold of Yakutia and the fear that threatened to paralyze him. He was not a hunter. He was the guardian of a precious life. The wolves, sensing their leader's hesitation, stirred, growling low and scratching at the snow. The circle was closing, and Ayana felt the air grow denser, laden with the wild scent. He couldn't be cornered. With a swift movement, he drew his hunting knife, the cold bone handle against his palm. It wasn't to kill, but to create a barrier, a reminder that he wouldn't be easy prey. The blade, sharp as a mammoth's tooth, gleamed palely under the faint light of the Arctic day. Ayana released another arrow, this time towards bolder wolves approaching from the right. It whizzed past one of them, which recoiled with a yelp of surprise. The young hunter knew he needed to be unpredictable, to use fear and uncertainty as his weapons. He began to move in small circles, keeping his gaze on the leader, but attentive to every movement of the pack. His feet sank into the deep snow, making each step an effort, but he couldn't stop. Stamina was a luxury, but determination was inexhaustible. Old Grey finally made a decision. With a deeper growl, he advanced, not running, but with a deliberate gait. His eyes showed not anger, but a cold, relentless hunger. Ayana felt his heart clench. It was the moment of truth. He raised his bow again, his aim more precise, more focused. He didn't want to wound, but he needed to send a clear message. His grandmother's life depended on his ability to stand firm, to show that even young and alone, he was a force to be reckoned with in the merciless vastness of Yakutia. The battle was just beginning, and Ayana, breath held, was ready for every challenge the tundra and its wild inhabitants could throw at him. Old Grey advanced, not with the haste of a hungry animal, but with the calculated calm of an experienced predator. Each step sank into the snow, but his eyes, cold and piercing, never left Ayana's. The young hunter felt a chill run down his spine, but it wasn't just the 71°C cold. It was the recognition of intelligence in those wild eyes. He knew he couldn't show weakness. His grandmother's life, the image of her fragile smile, was the shield that kept him from crumbling. With a roar that seemed to tear the icy air, Ayana released the arrow already nocked in his bow. This time, he didn't aim at the ground, but slightly above the leader wolf's head. The arrow whistled, tearing through the air and embedding itself in a small snowdrift just behind Old Grey. The sharp, unexpected sound and the projectile's proximity made the leader stop abruptly. His ears twitched, catching the sound, and for a brief instant hesitation crossed his eyes. It was what Ayana sought, to plant doubt, to break the certainty of an easy hunt, but the pack was too vast to be contained by a single act of bravery. While the leader pondered, the younger, more impatient wolves on the flanks began to close the circle again, moving like grey shadows in the snow. Ayana spun, his bow still raised, his eyes sweeping the immense horde. He felt cold sweat trickle down his temples, mixing with the ice that already coated his eyelashes. His lungs burned with each breath, but he couldn't give in to exhaustion. Memories of his grandfather's stories echoed in his mind. How ancient hunters used fire, sound, and their very presence to ward off predators. Ayana had no fire, but he had his voice and his unbreakable spirit. He let out a hoarse cry, a primal sound that came from his gut, and stomped his foot hard in the snow, trying to simulate the strength and fury of a larger animal. Some closer wolves recoiled a step, surprised by the young man's display of ferocity. Ayana knew he needed to maintain his distance. He began to retreat slowly, one step at a time, always facing the pack, his eyes fixed on Old Grey. With each retreat, he drew another arrow, keeping the bow taut, ready to fire. His fingers were numb, but the need to protect his grandmother was a warmth that propelled him, a force that overcame pain and cold. He was not just a boy, he was a link in the long chain of his family, and that chain would not break on his watch. The wolves, though cautious, were hungry. Hunger was a powerful force, and 800 hungry mouths were a tide that could hardly be contained. Old Grey, regaining his composure, let out a low growl, a silent command to his pack. The wolves advanced again, more coordinated, more determined. Ayana felt his heart clench. The knife at his waist felt heavy, but he knew it was his last resort. He needed a strategy, something that could turn the tide, even for an instant. The tundra was relentless, but Ayana, driven by unconditional love, was determined to be even more so. His eyes, previously fixed on Old Grey, now swept the landscape, seeking not an escape, but inspiration. The icy wind whispered in his ears, and for a moment it seemed to carry his grandmother's soft voice, reminding him of stories of how ancient hunters not only fought, but also conversed with nature. He spotted a small rocky outcrop, almost imperceptible beneath the layer of snow, about 30 meters away. It wasn't a refuge, but a platform, a slightly elevated point. The idea struck him like a ray of sunshine in winter. With a sudden cry, Ayana began to run towards the rock, not fleeing, but charging. The pack, surprised by the change in tactics, hesitated for an instant. Old Grey let out a growl of confusion, but the closest wolves began to pursue him. Ayana ran with the strength of one carrying the weight of a life. His muscles burned, the frozen air seared his lungs, but the image of his grandmother, her pale face and eyes full of hope, was an inexhaustible engine. He reached the rock, leaping onto it with agility. From atop it, even if only by a few centimeters, he felt a little taller, a little more visible. He raised his bow, not to shoot, but to use the wood as an extension of his body, a symbol of his unwavering presence. The wolves surrounded him at the base of the rock, their growls now more intense, their eyes gleaming with a hunger that seemed almost palpable. Ayana felt fear clench his stomach, but he transformed it into a cold flame of determination. He was not cornered prey, he was a guardian. With a firm gesture, he struck the back of his bow against the rock, producing a hollow, resonant sound that echoed in the stillness of the tundra. The sound, amplified by the rock, was unexpected and made some wolves recoil, their ears twitching in alarm. Old Grey, however, held his ground, his eyes fixed on Ayana's, trying to decipher the young man's intention. Ayana knew he needed more. He began to sing, an ancient song, a melody his grandmother sang to him on the coldest nights, a song about the strength of the human spirit and harmony with nature. His voice, initially trembling, gained strength, blending with the howling wind, a strange and powerful sound that contrasted with the pack's growls. The wolves, accustomed only to the sounds of the hunt and the wind, grew confused. Some tilted their heads, others retreated further. Ayana's song was not a physical threat, but a demonstration of a different kind of strength, a resilience they did not expect. He was not fighting with teeth and claws, but with his soul, with the very essence of his humanity. His face, marked by cold and tension, now displayed a strange serenity, a courage that came from a deep place of love and duty. Ayana, the young hunter, was transforming despair into a melody of hope, defying the very logic of survival in Yakutia. Ayana, his voice choked by cold and emotion, continued the ancestral melody. It was not a war chant, but a lament, a plea and a declaration of life. The notes, once timid, resonated with the strength of his soul, echoing across the frozen plains. The wolves, once fierce, seemed perplexed. Some lowered their heads, others moved away, eyes fixed on the young man who, atop the rock, defied logic with a song. Old Grey maintained his stance, but Ayana perceived uncertainty in his eyes. Music, he knew, was a language that transcended species, a primordial link with the tundra. His grandmother always said that music carried the history of their people, pain, joy, resilience, and hope. Ayana poured all of this into his song. He not only sang, he projected his will, his unconditional love for his hungry and frail grandmother. Each note was an invisible thread between him and the pack, a barrier of emotion insurmountable for the predators. Lips cracked by the cold, he did not stop. Cold sweat trickled down his forehead. The flame in his heart burned stronger. He felt ancestral strength flow, the wisdom of generations who had faced and respected Yakutia. The younger, more impatient wolves showed restlessness. They moved, growling, torn between hunger and the barrier of the song. Old Grey, sensing the disorder, let out a short howl, trying to reassert his leadership. The sound seemed weak, lost in the air, compared to the young man's melody. Ayana seized the moment. He intensified his singing, eyes fixed on the leaders, transmitting a clear message. He was not prey. He was part of the tundra, a spirit as untamed as the wind and ice. He felt his legs tremble, but refused to yield. With each passing second, the pack grew more confused, less cohesive. Some wolves began to move away, retreating slowly, as if the scene was disturbing. Old Grey seemed to struggle against his own nature, the pack's hunger versus the reverence inspired by the song. Ayana knew he was at the limit of his strength, but the thought of his grandmother and the promise he had made kept him from stopping. Ayana's song, which began as despair, turned into a hymn of resistance. He was no longer just defending himself. He was asserting his existence against the vastness of nature. His gestures were broad and firm, his hands holding the bow like a ceremonial staff. He wasn't shooting arrows. He was casting his soul to the wind, an invisible force that pushed the predators back. The human connection, the resilience forged in love, manifested itself. Not even 800 hungry wolves could ignore it. The tundra, once an enemy, seemed to witness a miracle driven by a boy's courage. Old Grey finally lowered his head, an almost imperceptible sign of defeat. He let out one last growl, more a lament than a threat, moving away through the snow. The pack, without their leader's command, dispersed, grey forms vanishing into the whiteness. Ayana continued singing until the last wolf vanished from sight, his voice choked with a mix of relief and exhaustion. He had succeeded, not with violence, but with the unbreakable strength of his spirit. Ayana felt his body relax, the tension that had kept him standing dissipating like smoke in the icy wind. His voice, once a hymn of resistance, was now just a hoarse whisper. His legs trembled uncontrollably, and he collapsed onto the rock, the cold penetrating his garments and bones. The icy air burned his lungs with each ragged breath, and the frozen sweat on his forehead made his skin taut. He closed his eyes for an instant, the silence of the tundra, once menacing, now a balm for his exhausted soul. He had succeeded. The wolves were gone. But the victory was only partial. The image of his grandmother, frail and hungry, rose in his mind, sharper than ever. Her stomach needed food, and he still had nothing. Exhaustion was overwhelming, a heavy cloak that threatened to drag him into a deep sleep. He just wanted to lie there in the snow and let the cold take him. But the love for his grandmother was an anchor, an unquenchable fire in his chest. He opened his eyes, his gaze sweeping the desolate landscape. The pale sun of Yakutia began to descend, painting the horizon with cold shades of blue and purple. Soon, the darkness of the Arctic night would swallow everything, and with it, the cold would intensify even further. He had no time for rest. The hunt had to continue, but where to find an animal after having scared away a pack of 800 wolves? The tundra seemed empty, devoid of life. With a groan of effort, Ayana stood up, every muscle protesting. The bow felt heavier in his hands, and the knife at his waist a burden. He began to walk, dragging his feet through the deep snow, his eyes alert for any sign of life. Hours passed, or perhaps just minutes, time losing its meaning in the white vastness. Hope began to fade, replaced by a growing anguish. What if he found nothing? What if his grandmother? Ayana shuddered, pushing away the terrible thought. He couldn't fail. It was then that amidst a small depression in the snow, almost hidden by a frozen bush, he saw it. A small brown shape, motionless. His heart leaped. It was a reindeer calf. He approached cautiously, bow ready, but his intention was not to hunt. The calf lay curled up, trembling. Its large, dark eyes, full of fear and weakness, stared at Ayana. It was a newborn calf, perhaps abandoned by its mother or lost from the herd. Ayana noticed the animal's front leg, caught in a crack in the ice, bleeding slightly. The calf whimpered softly, a sound that pierced the young hunter's heart. The hunger in his own stomach was a cry, but the sight of such a vulnerable creature awakened something deeper. Killing a calf, especially a wounded one, went against everything his grandmother and the elders had taught him about respect for life and the balance of nature. Ayana knelt beside the calf. The icy air seemed sharper now, and the dilemma that assailed him was heavier than any cold. His grandmother needed meat, and here was a source, small but present. However, the purity in the calf's eyes, its fragility, stopped him. How could he, who had just driven away a horde of predators with the strength of his spirit, now become a predator of such a defenseless creature? His grandmother, with her wisdom, would never approve. She always said that true strength lay not in taking life, but in preserving it, in finding harmony even in the most hostile environment. He reached out, hesitant, and touched the calf's damp muzzle. The animal didn't recoil, it just trembled more, seeking warmth. Ayana felt a wave of compassion. He couldn't do it. He couldn't sacrifice the innocence of that calf, not after everything. His love for his grandmother was unconditional, yes, but it was not a love that demanded the loss of his own humanity. He needed to find another way. Carefully, Ayana began to examine the calf's injured leg. His fingers, though numb, worked with delicacy. He felt the fracture and knew the animal wouldn't survive on its own. A new purpose, as urgent as his grandmother's hunger, ignited in his chest. He wouldn't hunt the calf, he would save it. This was the choice of a true guardian of Yakutia. Ayana, with numb fingers but a clear mind, began to work. The calf's leg was caught in a narrow crack in the ice, which seemed to have formed beneath the snow layer, invisible until the accident. With extreme delicacy, he tried to widen the opening using the tip of his knife, not to cut, but to break off small pieces of ice around the leg. Every movement was slow, calculated, for a mistake could worsen the small animal's fracture. The calf whimpered softly, a sound of pain that echoed in Ayana's chest, reminding him of life's fragility. The intense cold made the ice hard as rock, and progress was agonizing. Ayana felt the burning in his own fingers, which were already purple and numb, but compassion propelled him. He remembered his grandmother's stories about the interconnectedness of all lives on the tundra, about how even the smallest of beings had its place and its value. Freeing that calf was not just an act of kindness, it was an act of respect for Yakutia itself. Finally, after minutes that felt like an eternity, a larger piece of ice gave way, and the calf's leg could be gently pulled out. The calf let out a sigh, and Ayana could see the relief in its large, dark eyes. The leg was swollen and bleeding from a superficial cut, but the fracture was evident. Ayana tore a piece from his cloak, a thick, warm fabric, and carefully splinted the calf's leg, using thin branches he found nearby as improvised splints. The animal, though still frightened, allowed him to touch it, as if sensing the young man's pure intention. Ayana picked it up. The calf was surprisingly light, but the weight of his responsibility was immense. He couldn't simply leave it there to die. But what to do now? He had a wounded reindeer calf in his arms, and his grandmother was still hungry, waiting for him. Hunger, once a distant cry, now roared in his stomach. The sun was setting rapidly, and the night's cold promised to be even crueler. Taking the calf home meant deviating from his original purpose, the hunt, and risking his grandmother's life for an act of altruism she might not understand. But deep in his heart, Ayana knew she would understand. She had always taught him that true wealth lay not in hunted meat, but in the kindness of the heart. He began to walk again, the calf nestled in his arms, seeking the warmth of his body. Each step was a monumental effort, and exhaustion threatened to fell him. His eyes swept the landscape, no longer searching for prey, but for shelter, a place where he could protect the calf from the cold, and perhaps, just perhaps, find a solution to the dilemma that tormented him. Ayana knew he was risking everything. His grandmother's life depended on him, and he was deviating from the most direct path to survival. A small cave, almost a recess in the rock, appeared in his field of vision. It was small, but it offered some protection against the biting wind. Ayana, with his last strength, crawled inside, settling the calf on the compacted snow floor. He sat beside it, embracing it to share his warmth. The calf trembled, but then calmed, resting its head against Ayana's chest. In that moment, the young hunter felt a deep connection, proof that his choice, though difficult, had not been in vain. He needed food, yes, but he also needed to keep his soul intact. The darkness of the Arctic night swallowed the tundra, and Ayana, embracing the reindeer calf, felt the cold penetrate his bones. Hunger was a constant ache, but the sight of the small animal, safe in his arms, brought a strange peace. He knew that morning would bring new challenges, and that the search for food for his grandmother would become even more urgent. But for that night, he would be the guardian, not only of his grandmother, but also of that small, defenseless life the tundra had entrusted to him. He closed his eyes, his heart heavy, but his spirit unyielding, ready to face whatever came. The hours dragged on slowly, marked only by the distant howl of the wind and the slow rhythm of his own breathing. Ayana pressed the calf against his chest, sharing the meager warmth of his body, feeling the small life tremble slightly. His own limbs were numb, and weariness was a thick fog trying to cloud his mind. But even on the threshold of sleep, the image of his grandmother appeared, sharp and demanding. Her eyes, once full of hope, now seemed to carry a shadow of disappointment. A knot formed in Ayana's throat. He had promised to bring food, and now he was there, with a wounded calf that couldn't feed his grandmother. Guilt was a heavy burden, mixing with the cold and exhaustion. He wondered if he had made the right choice. His grandmother, so wise and strong, always prioritized the family's survival above all else. But she also valued compassion, kindness towards the weaker beings. "Ayana," she would say with her soft but firm voice. A hunter's heart must be as strong as his bow, but as gentle as the snow that covers the earth. He opened his eyes in the dark, gazing at the rocky ceiling of the small cave. The calf, sensing his movement, raised its head and looked at him with its large, innocent eyes. In that gaze, Ayana saw not just fear, but a silent trust, a dependence that touched him deeply. How could he, who had defied 800 wolves with the strength of his soul, now abandon this small creature? No, he couldn't. His grandmother had taught him that true strength lay in the ability to protect not only his own, but also those who could not protect themselves. With the first grey glimpse of dawn, Ayana felt a new surge of energy. The cold was still biting, but the darkness of the night, with its doubts and anxieties, began to recede. He observed the calf, which now seemed a little warmer, though still weak. The splinted leg was swollen, but didn't seem to be getting worse. Ayana knew he needed to act. Leaving the calf there meant condemning it. Taking it with him, however, would make the hunt even more difficult, a risk he couldn't afford to take. A new idea began to form in his mind, one that combined his grandmother's urgency with compassion for the calf. He couldn't hunt with the animal in his arms, but perhaps he could find a safe place for it, a shelter where it could recover while he searched for food. His eyes swept the landscape again, no longer with despair, but with renewed determination. He stood up carefully, the calf still nestled in his arms, and stepped out of the cave. The pale sun was barely beginning to rise, painting the sky a faint pink. The tundra stretched out vast and relentless, but Ayana felt that somewhere there would be a solution. He would not only seek food, but also a new home for the small creature life had entrusted to him. The journey would be long, but his heart, now lighter, was ready for the challenge. Ayana, with the calf in his arms, felt the weight of the new journey. The sun, still low on the horizon, cast long shadows over the untouched snow, and the morning air was an icy cut that penetrated his clothes. Each step was an effort, but the image of his grandmother, waiting and trusting, and the small life trembling in his arms, propelled him. He needed to find a safer shelter for the calf before resuming the hunt. The small recess where they had spent the night was merely a palliative, not a lasting refuge. His eyes swept the white immensity, searching for any sign of a deeper rock formation or a dense thicket of frozen bushes that could offer protection. The tundra, however, seemed infinite and uninhabited, a blank canvas where only the wind wrote its story. The calf, nestled against his chest, let out a soft whimper, and Ayana held it tighter, transmitting the little warmth he had left. The calf's splinted leg seemed a little better, but he knew the animal needed rest and, ideally, constant warmth to survive. The hunger in his own stomach was a cruel reminder of his main mission, his grandmother. He could almost smell the smoke of a campfire, the warmth of a meal. But with each moment he spent caring for the calf, the distance between him and his goal grew. Guilt, which had been momentarily appeased by compassion, began to gnaw at him again. He was risking his grandmother's life for an act of kindness towards a wild animal. Would his grandmother forgive him? Would she understand? He remembered her words. Ayana, true hunting is not just killing to eat, but understanding the rhythm of life, the dance between predator and prey, and sometimes the greatest hunt is oneself, your own fears and desires. These words resonated in his mind, an echo of the ancestral wisdom that now guided his uncertain steps. He couldn't abandon the calf, not after having made the choice. After another long period of walking, with aching muscles and a mind blurred by fatigue, Ayana spotted a more prominent rock formation on the horizon. It wasn't a cave, but a series of crevices and ledges that could offer more substantial shelter. With a thread of hope, he quickened his pace, his energy renewed by the possibility of refuge. As he approached, he realized the rock was older and more weathered than it appeared from a distance, with small cavities that wind and ice had carved over centuries. He chose the largest and most protected of the crevices, a recess that opened to the south, where the pale morning sun could, for a few hours, offer a little warmth. Carefully, he lined the ground with a layer of soft, dry snow, and then, with some thin branches and dry leaves, he managed to pull from nearby bushes, creating an improvised bed insulated from the cold ground. He laid the calf there, watching it nestle in, its large eyes fixed on his, a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. Ayana touched the calf's muzzle once more, a gesture of farewell and promise. "Stay safe, little one. I will return," he whispered. His voice choked. The separation was difficult but necessary. He needed to be a hunter now, not a guardian of calves. With his bow in hand and knife exposed, he moved away from the improvised shelter, his heart heavy with departure, but his mind focused. The tundra called him again, and this time he couldn't fail. His grandmother's life depended on the success of his next hunt, and he felt that time was running out quickly. He looked back one last time, seeing the small brown shape curled up in the rock crevice, almost invisible against the landscape. That act of kindness had consumed precious time, but Ayana knew he had preserved something more important than meat, his own soul. Now, it was time to face Yakutia with the same determination he had used against the wolves, but with a new burden of responsibility. He needed to hunt and fast. The wind howled, carrying with it the promise of an even colder night. Ayana moved away from the improvised shelter, the echo of his own words, "Stay safe, little one. I will return," still resonating in his ears. Each step in the deep snow was an effort, and the cold seemed to have intensified, biting his exposed skin and freezing the moisture in his nostrils. The sun, now a pale, distant disk on the horizon, offered very little warmth, and the elongated shadows of the tundra stretched like icy fingers, foreshadowing the imminent darkness. Ayana felt the weight of the bow in his hands, no longer like a ceremonial staff, but as a heavy and vital tool. The knife at his waist seemed a constant reminder of the brutal task ahead. Guilt for having deviated from his path, for having spent precious hours with the reindeer calf, gnawed at him from within. His grandmother, frail and dependent, was alone, hungry. He could almost smell the smoke of a campfire that didn't exist, the warmth of a meal she wouldn't have if he failed. A knot tightened in his throat, and he blinked to ward off the tears the cold tried to freeze in his eyes. There was no time for regrets, only for action. He swept the landscape with a trained gaze, searching for any sign of life. The tundra, however, seemed deserted, a vast, relentless white sheet. The wolf tracks, once a threat, were now just a reminder of scarcity. The pack had scared away any potential prey for miles. Ayana knew he would need to go further, venture into territories he rarely explored, where the risk was greater and the terrain more treacherous. Exhaustion was a constant companion, his muscles protesting with every movement. He felt the weakness in his legs, the tremor in his hands. But the image of his grandmother, her gentle smile, the silent strength in her eyes, was a balm for his exhausted soul, an unquenchable fire that propelled him. He remembered the stories she told about ancestral hunters, men and women who faced the impossible with courage and wisdom. "True hunting, Ayana," she had once said, "is not just the strength of the arm, but the patience of the spirit and the cunning of the mind." With these words echoing, Ayana changed his strategy. Instead of searching for large herds, he began to look for subtle signs, for small clues that nature offered. He knelt, examining the snow, looking for fresh tracks, for broken branches, for any indication that a solitary animal might have passed. His eyes, accustomed to the white vastness, now focused on minute details, on the wind patterns in the snow, on the color changes that indicated the presence of vegetation beneath the icy layer. Hours dragged on. The sun disappeared completely, and the darkness of the Arctic night swallowed the landscape, bringing with it an even more intense cold. Ayana felt his fingers and feet numb, even with the furs that covered them. Hope began to fade, replaced by a chilling despair. What if he found nothing? What if his grandmother? He shook his head, pushing away the thought. He couldn't give up. It was then that, amidst the gloom, near a dark rock formation, he saw something. Not a footprint, but a small mound of snow that seemed out of place. With his heart pounding in his chest, Ayana approached cautiously. It was a small bush covered in snow, but something was moving underneath. He waited, motionless, the air freezing in his lungs. A subtle movement, an almost inaudible rustle. It was an Arctic hare curled up, trying to camouflage itself in the snow. Small, yes, but it was life. It was food. Ayana felt a wave of relief mixed with a pang of sadness. It wasn't what he expected, but it was enough to keep his grandmother alive for another day. With bated breath, he drew his bow, his fingers stiff, but his aim steady. Time seemed to stop. Ayana's heart pounded, and the cold in his lungs was a sharp pain. He pulled the string to its limit, feeling the tension in his frozen muscles. The Arctic hare, curled up, didn't perceive the danger. The image of his grandmother, pale and hungry, superseded any hesitation. He released the arrow. The soft whistle cut the icy air. A clean, precise shot. The hare gave a small leap and fell motionless in the snow. Ayana felt relief and a heavy burden. He knelt, picking up the small animal. It was small, yes, but the promise of one more day of life. A breath of hope. He tucked the hare into his cloak, pressing it against his body. The journey back began, each step more difficult. Exhaustion was a fog. The cold penetrated his bones. Ayana felt the weight of his choices. Saving the reindeer calf had diverted him from his main mission for precious hours. Now he had a hare, scarce but vital food. Would it be enough? Guilt and hope danced in his soul. He remembered the calf's trusting gaze. What if it hadn't survived? An urgency propelled him. He needed to check on the calf before heading home. Logic told him to go straight to his grandmother, but his heart, divided between two vulnerable lives, wouldn't allow it. The wind picked up, whipping snow against his face. The darkness of night was almost complete. Stars dotted the sky with cruel intensity. Ayana quickened his pace, muscles burning, lungs aching. He needed to reach the calf's shelter before the cold became unbearable. Finally, the rock formation appeared in his vision, a dark silhouette. Ayana hurried, his heart pounding, half fear, half hope. He crawled to the crevice, calling softly, "Little one, are you there?" Silence was the only answer. A chill ran down his spine. He fumbled in the dark, fear tightening his throat. And then he felt a movement. The calf was there, curled up under the branches and leaves. It trembled slightly at the touch of Ayana's hand, but it was alive. Its large, dark eyes opened, reflecting the faint light. A sigh of relief escaped Ayana's lips, tears freezing on his eyelashes. He had kept his promise. The calf was safe. But the hair in his cloak was a cruel reminder of his grandmother. He couldn't stay there. He needed to move on, to bring food to his only family. Ayana touched the calf's muzzle once more, a gesture of affection and farewell. "I will return," he whispered, his voice choked by emotion and cold. He stood up, his body protesting, but his spirit strengthened by the certainty of having done what was right. The tundra awaited him, and so did his grandmother. The climax was not the hunt itself, but the reaffirmation of his values. Compassion and promise could guide his steps even in the face of hunger and despair. He departed carrying the small hare and the responsibility for two lives, each weighing on his heart. Ayana knew the journey was far from over, but a new strength, forged in compassion and resilience, propelled him home, to his grandmother, to the uncertain future in the icy vastness of Yakutia. The promise of return, for both the calf and his grandmother, was his new compass. Ayana turned, leaving the improvised shelter behind, the small form of the reindeer calf etched in his mind. The promise of return, for both the calf and his grandmother, was his new compass. But the journey back was a heavy burden. The hare, though vital, was a reminder of scarcity, and with each step in the snow, doubt gnawed at his heart. Would it be enough? The wind, now a constant lament, whipped snow against his face, and the cold seemed to have deepened, penetrating his furs and bones. The darkness of the Arctic night was almost total, stars dotting the sky with cruel intensity. But Ayana couldn't afford to stop. The image of his grandmother, frail and alone in the small cabin, was a fire that propelled him. He could almost smell the smoke of the campfire she would be waiting for, the warmth of a meal he needed to bring. Guilt for having deviated from his path, for having spent precious hours with the wounded calf, was a constant weight. But the sight of the small animal's trusting eyes and the feeling of having kept a promise also strengthened him. His muscles burned, his lungs seared with the icy air, but he quickened his pace, the small body of the hare in his cloak, a precious treasure. Finally, after what seemed like endless hours, the familiar silhouette of his grandmother's cabin appeared in the gloom. A small wisp of smoke, almost invisible, rose from the chimney, a sign of life, of hope. Ayana felt a knot in his throat loosen, and a sigh of relief escaped his lips. He ran the last few meters, the wooden door creaking softly as he opened it. The warmth, though faint, enveloped him like an embrace. His grandmother lay on her bed, her eyes closed, her breath weak. Ayana knelt beside her, his heart tight. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice choked. Her eyes opened slowly, clouded with weariness, but a glimmer of recognition appeared in them. A faint smile formed on her lips. "Ayana, my grandson," she murmured, her voice almost inaudible. He took the hair from his cloak, presenting it with a mix of pride and apprehension. "I brought food, Grandma. It's small, but it's fresh." He began to explain about the calf, about the choice, about the promise, his words stumbling in his urgency and guilt. His grandmother, however, raised a trembling hand, touching his face. "I know, my child. I always knew your heart was big. True strength lies not just in the hunt, but in the kindness you carry. You did what was right." Her words were a balm for his soul, dissolving the guilt that tormented him. He felt tears freeze on his eyelashes again, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude. Ayana prepared the small hare, and the smell of cooked meat soon filled the cabin, an aroma of life and survival. They ate in silence, each bite a reminder of the journey, the struggle, and the love that bound them. The meal was scarce, but the warmth of the fire and each other's presence were a feast for their souls. That night, nestled beside his grandmother, Ayana felt a profound peace. He had faced the wolves, the relentless cold, hunger, and his own doubts. He had chosen compassion, and in doing so, had found a greater strength within himself. Yakutia was still a dangerous place, and life would be a continuous struggle, but he was not alone. He had his grandmother, her wisdom, and the promise of a return to the small calf. The future was uncertain, but Ayana knew that with a strong heart and an unyielding spirit, he and his grandmother would find a way, forged in the icy furnaces of the Arctic together. The next morning brought not only the pale light of the Arctic sun, but a renewed clarity to Ayana's heart. The faint warmth of the fire still crackled, and the soft aroma of hare meat, though scarce, lingered in the air, a reminder of his victory. His grandmother slept deeply, her face serene. Ayana watched her, feeling love and gratitude. He had fulfilled his most immediate promise, food and warmth, but another promise echoed in his soul, the promise to the small reindeer calf. He knew he needed to return. He rose silently, preparing a small portion of the hare meat for his grandmother and himself. The cabin, his refuge against the fury of Yakutia, needed him to honor all his commitments. With his bow in hand and knife at his waist, he kissed his sleeping grandmother's forehead, a gesture of silent farewell and a promise of return. The air outside was icy, but Ayana felt stronger, determined. The tundra, once a relentless enemy, was now a challenge to be overcome. The journey back to the calf's shelter was less agonizing. Ayana knew the way, propelled by a new urgency. Upon spotting the rock formation, his heart quickened. He crawled to the crevice, calling softly, "Little one, are you there?" This time there was no silence, a small movement, a rustle of leaves, and then the calf's curious muzzle appeared, followed by its large, dark eyes. It was alive, and it seemed stronger, less tremulous. Ayana felt immense relief, a warmth that the cold couldn't extinguish. He knelt, offering a piece of the hare meat to the calf, which nibbled timidly. Ayana smiled, feeling a sense of completeness. But the calf couldn't stay there forever. As he watched it, Ayana noticed something in the distance, a small herd of reindeer, perhaps 5 or 6, grazing in a field of lichens exposed by the wind. They were far, but not so far that the calf couldn't reach them if he helped it. It was the perfect solution, a gift from Yakutia itself, a sign of hope. Ayana picked up the calf carefully, feeling its light weight and warmth. He walked slowly towards the herd, the calf nestled in his arms, looking at the world with new curiosity. He felt he was returning the small creature to its rightful place, completing the cycle of life his grandmother had taught him. As he approached, the herd raised their heads, alert. Ayana gently placed the calf on the snow. The small animal, after hesitating, limped towards its kin. An adult reindeer approached, sniffing the calf with tenderness. Ayana watched the scene, tears freezing, a mix of sadness and joy from the certainty of having done what was right. He had saved a life, returning it to nature. That moment under the vast Arctic sky proved that kindness and resilience flourish in the most hostile environment. He turned, letting the herd move away. The wind howled, but his heart was light, full of peace. Upon reaching the cabin, his grandmother was waiting for him. "You've returned, my grandson." "I knew you would," she said with a smile. Ayana told her about the calf. He was no longer just a hunter, but a guardian. He had found his purpose in the icy furnaces of the Arctic, forged in compassion and resilience. Together, they would face the future, certain that love was the greatest weapon against the relentless winter. The next morning, cold and silent, found Ayana and his grandmother nestled in the faint warmth of the cabin. The smoke from the fire rose lazily, carrying the comforting aroma of hare meat. Ayana watched his grandmother, her face marked by time, but now softened by a deep, peaceful sleep. The pale glow of the Arctic sun entered through the small opening, painting the melted snow floor with golden hues. He felt a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time, a calm that came from the certainty of having done what was right, not just for survival, but for the soul. His journey had been a baptism of ice and fire, facing the wolf pack, hunger, despair, and the guilt of having deviated from his path to save the reindeer calf. All of it had transformed him. His grandmother's words about true hunting being oneself, one's fears and desires, echoed with new meaning. He was no longer just a boy hunter, but a guardian, a link in the chain of life, understanding the delicate dance between necessity and compassion. When his grandmother awoke, their eyes met. A soft smile formed on her lips. "You've grown, my grandson," she said, her voice hoarse but full of deep tenderness. "Not just in stature, but in spirit. The tundra teaches harsh lessons, but also reveals the strength that resides in a pure heart." She extended her hand, and Ayana held it, feeling the roughness of her skin and the wisdom that emanated from her. That touch was warmer than any campfire, safer than any shelter. Ayana knew that life in Yakutia offered no respite. Hunting was a daily necessity, the search for firewood, a constant task. But now he faced these responsibilities with a new perspective. It was not an overwhelming burden, but a purpose. He stood up, adjusting his furs and picking up his bow. "I'll check the traps near the frozen river, Grandma, and maybe get more firewood." There was no despair in his voice, only a calm determination. The air outside was biting, but Ayana no longer felt the same paralyzing cold as before. The white landscape, once menacing, now seemed familiar, a territory he had learned to respect and understand. He observed the wind patterns in the snow, the subtle tracks of animals, each detail a part of life's grand tapestry. His senses were sharpened, his mind clear. He felt connected to the land, a part of it, a guardian of its secrets and its creatures. As he walked, Ayana saw smoke from another cabin in the distance, a small grey dot against the pale blue sky. It was the cabin of old friends of his grandmother, people who also struggled daily for survival. He thought about how his actions, his battle against the wolves, his act of kindness towards the calf, and his dedication to his grandmother, and could resonate in the small community, not for vainglory, but as a silent reminder of the strength they all possessed, of the ability to overcome the impossible when moved by love and courage. Ayana paused for a moment, inhaling the icy air. The future was uncertain, Yakutia relentless, but he was no longer alone in his burden. He carried his grandmother's wisdom, the memory of the saved calf, and the certainty of his own resilience. Life was a succession of challenges, but also of small victories, of acts of kindness that warmed the soul more than any campfire. With a serene smile, he continued his way. A young Yakut, forged in the icy furnaces of the Arctic, ready to embrace whatever came, with a heart full of hope and an unyielding spirit.